Nothing in this interview should be taken as financial advice. I have a sponsorship with the XX Network, therefore I am biased towards them.
Hi, everyone. Today we have a very special guest that I'm a huge fan of personally. We have Doomberg on the show. How are you today, Doomberg?
Hey, Darren, I'm doing great. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Can you give us just an introduction on what is Doomberg and what do you do?
Sure. Yeah, I'm the head writer of a Substack called Doomberg, which you can find at doomberg.substack.com. We are a small team of executives from the commodity sector, former executives, I should say. Doomberg is what we do for a living now. And we write about energy, finance, and the economy at large, publishing anywhere between 6 to 8 pieces a month, depending on the length of the month and the cadence of our publication schedule. And, it's been an amazing ride. We've been doing this for over 2 years now, up past 250,000 followers on Twitter and 160,000 email subscribers on Substack. And it's been a blast. And, looking forward to today's discussion.
Thanks. So when we first saw wheat and nat gas spike, that kind of foreshadowed inflation. And now we're seeing the opposite happen. We're seeing commodities really take a beating. In your opinion, is that something that kind of foreshadows deflation, like a whirlwind of deflation that might happen?
I don't think so. So I would, it's probably best to contextualize how it is that we got to the point where many of the commodities are struggling. The primary driver behind this is partially, at least in response to the energy crisis that started in Europe and spread to China and the rest of the world pretty quickly in 2022. But in reality, I think the main driver has been an unseasonably warm winter in the Northern Hemisphere, and in particular in Europe. And what we find in the commodity sector is that price elasticity of demand is such that it doesn't take much in the way of imbalances on either side of the flows to drive historic price spikes and rapid price collapses, which is what we have seen. And I would also say that part of the sort of wheat/natural gas/energy commodity prices in general spike was potentially an overestimation of the West's ability to restrict Russian commodities from finding their way to the market. This was something that we wrote about several times, that the objective to try to sanction their volume was always foolhardy. And in fact, I would say that the collapse in energy prices, although oil is still quite elevated to historical comparisons, that collapse in commodity prices is the greatest weapon we have against Vladimir Putin, and trying to sanction his volume was always foolhardy. So at the apex of the energy crisis/outbreak of the war in Ukraine, there was an extraordinary amount of risk built into the markets as well, as people were pondering what the world would look like without wheat or precious metals or the energy commodities from Russia finding their way to the market. And that what we have observed is concurrent with this unusually warm winter, Russian commodities are in fact finding their way to the market, perhaps even in some instances at a discount. And so all of that is sort of an input, and we've gone from a sort of fear of scarcity of supply to a surprisingly sort of warm winter leading to an excess of supply. And I think perhaps some overconfidence in the market that next winter will be the same as last winter. I think all bets are off if we have an unusually cold winter coming up, but that's for another day.
So we've seen a lot of the BRICS nations kind of branch off and kind of try to remove themselves from the dollar hegemony, and they're using digital currencies to bypass dollar hegemony. As a matter of fact, China has like an entire banking system, right? They even have correspondent banks, SIPs, they have their own SWIFT system. Do you think that's a threat to dollar hegemony? Do you think BRICS nations can successfully branch off from the dollar system and create their own system?
It's a pretty controversial topic, especially if you're on FinTwit. It's argued about over and over. I would say it is certainly a series of events well worth observing and noting. I would say that for the vast majority of the quote Western world, the US dollar's prominence as both a reserve currency and perhaps to a lesser extent as a neutral reserve asset will remain strong. Does there exist the possibility that a significant portion of the world, perhaps relatively small from an economic perspective today, but perhaps growing to compete and even surpass the sort of G7 nations, could they develop a system where they predominantly trade within their own currencies, digital or otherwise, and they settle their international trade imbalances in some basket of commodities, with gold playing a potentially significant part in that. Is that a real possibility? We would say absolutely. And we would say that the dozens and dozens of headlines that we have observed across the Bloomberg terminal in the past 18 months to that effect stand as proof that something is up. It might be moving slow. It might not displace the US dollar, but could a block of countries eventually compete with US dollar hegemony? I think absolutely. And I think it's very clearly the stated intent of China to lead such an.
Yeah, I've been following this very closely as well, and there certainly is a push. And I noted that there is like 19 applications to join the BRICS countries, and that's not like a small number, right? It's increasing dramatically, and my guess is it's going to continue its trend just because of the things that we have done. I mean, at points it almost seems like it's intentional, right? Like there's there's people that understand Triffin's dilemma, and they're like honestly trying to push people away from dollars. Do you think that there's any truth to that?
So we're more in the incompetence camp than sort of the nefarious camp. If you pushed us, I think, based on our own personal interactions with government officials over the years, the opportunity to sit down with somebody and pull on their arm and explain to them how the world works from your unique vantage point of expertise can have a surprisingly large impact on our politics. I would point no further than our good friend Dr. Chris Kiefer's work at Canadians for Nuclear Energy, and his ability to get a one-on-one meeting with Justin Trudeau, which seems to have played a significant role in flipping the Liberal Party of Canada's position on something as important as nuclear energy. I know that's a bit off tangent, but it's an important input in my mind to the fact that dark conspiracies need not explain events when simple incompetence will do. And maybe that's a bit of an optimistic appraisal, but I frankly don't want to live in a world where we're proactively trying to destroy ourselves. Sort of a Pascal's wager situation, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is this shift to kind of nationalize things, right? We've seen with the CHIPS Act, trying to onboard semiconductors into the United States. A lot of our supply chain is globalized, and it brings us to into a problem if we got into a war, so, right? Like if all of our pharmaceuticals are overseas, everything is overseas, we can really fight a war if everything that we are using in the war is made outside of the US. And I think, do you think there's a more of a shift to nationalize, to move towards nationalized versus globalized world?
Well, there's a recognition that we need to do so. And this is, of course, as our friend Luke Roman likes to point out, a pretty plausible explanation as to why it is that, for example, the US military might not want the US to keep the dollar reserve status, because that almost necessarily disadvantages the manufacturing sector, which leads to offshoring, which we saw for decades. And that leads to a situation where countries like China control critical choke points in many value chains or supply chains. And look no further than sort of the green energy agenda. I mean, China controls 98 to 99% of a couple of the most important steps in the production of solar panels. They control effectively 100% of rare earth concentrate purification steps to make the high purity metals needed for high performance magnets that make wind turbines and electric motors go. And so we put ourselves in this position where we are not just militarily, but also just from sort of a domestic economic perspective, finding ourselves at the whims of the Chinese Communist Party, which is not a very comfortable position to be in. And then on the chips, of course, Taiwan plays a key role in that. And I think there's a lot of undercurrents around the criticality of that technology and the risk of it falling into the hands of the Chinese, and the Chinese, on the other hand, looking to diversify away from what they see as unfair, trade embargoes from the US in that same sector. So I think it's all sort of commingled. But at the highest level, to answer your question specifically, the military has undoubtedly, since many, many years, pointed out the fact that the US dollar hegemony has led to an offshoring of US manufacturing, which has led to significant risks in the military supply chain, especially in a world where the two main combatants, either sort of hot or cold, would be China and the US. And so, yeah, that's a real challenge. Not sure we'll be able to overcome it. It's not like our policies are so well synced and coordinated that they appear to be very effective. But this is certainly an accurate characterization of the is state.
So you brought up green energy, and I want to know if you've studied any of the blockchains that are specific for green energy. I know a lot of green energy type of ESG things there's greenwashing, there's all types of different fraud that happens with green energy, and by applying a distributed ledger, you're able to account for carbon credits where you couldn't have fraud. You wouldn't be able to kind of kind of have fraud in the system. There's no duplicates. Everything is what it is on a distributed ledger. So I'm just curious if you've looked into any of the blockchains that are specific with green energy.
We have not, because we sort of stop our analysis at the point where we don't think carbon credits, certainly the voluntary carbon credit market, makes any sense. It is really sort of a sleight of hand on the part of the carbon intense sectors of our economy to try to appear as though they can simply pay a VIG and that somewhere, somehow, carbon emissions are being offset somewhere else in the world. And ultimately, I think it distracts from the fundamental challenges and decisions that we have to make as a society now. We happen to be pretty skeptical about our society's willingness to forego the carbon emissions that make our high standard of living possible. But the obfuscation of the decisions, we would be opposed to those on either side. And so we would be opposed to sort of green radical environmentalists proposing things that are much harder to implement than they are letting on, i.e. obfuscating challenge. And then we would be opposed to the existing sort of industrial sector's desire to greenwash away their emissions, which are absolutely essential to the running of their businesses, by paying a small VIG to some, offshore carbon sequesterer. So a classic example, of course, is the airline industry, which has no hope of ever abating its carbon emissions. So either, by 2050, when everything is going to be, quote, net zero, either all of our airplanes will still be, powered by jet fuel, or nobody will be flying. And if that is the decision, then we should put that decision to our society. The environmentalists should come out and say they don't want poor people to fly. They want poor people to stay poor and to have a lower standard of living, because their standard of living is a threat to the planet that they're trying to protect. And we should encourage our emissions intense sectors to say, no, like this is the trade-off of having global mobility. And if we're unwilling to make that trade-off, then let's at least be honest about it and put the correct decision on the ballot. To the extent that the voluntary carbon credits obfuscate that necessary decision, I think they're just a nuisance distraction.
Yeah, I've noticed myself just looking at airlines, they'll tell me how many emissions each airline has and try to suggest one that doesn't have as many emissions versus another one. And I mean, with tokenization, right, you would be able to have some type of I don't know, social credit score, or you'd be able to pay with carbon credits in order to use more carbon credits, right? I mean, you could set up a system where people are only allowed a certain amount of carbon credits, and it kind of sets up this dystopian type of nightmare where only the rich will be able to enjoy life to its fullest extent, while the poor people will have to go out of their way to pay to use such things. But I saw an interview where you were talking about one of the acts that they recently signed, and a floodgate of money headed towards this sector, just the ESG type of sector. And a lot of the companies that the president names, and some of the addresses that he's made, he's written out some papers, and he's literally listed some of the companies that are in the blockchain space, specifically Rocky Mountain Institute. They were a big proponent for Energy Web Token. They had a lot of EWT tokens that they ended up selling, but they still hold a lot of EWT tokens. So, there's this kind of schizophrenic view with crypto, right? Because we see a lot of big players that are former Treasury, former Fed, former IMF, move into projects that are trying to kind of enhance the system, not necessarily take it down, like we've seen with the cypherpunk movement, right? So like crypto's cypherpunk movement, that's where a lot of this stems, and it's a kind of down with the system mentality. But there's a lot of projects that are trying to use crypto assets or public blockchains to enhance the system. My question is do you think that they're honestly trying to push more money into the green energy sector and specific projects that they have in mind? Is that something that you've found in your research?
Well, I mean, the act that you're talking about is the historic deluge of funds that will emanate from the Inflation Reduction Act, which, I mean, I would imagine that blockchain, quote unquote, would be far less than a fraction of a % of that money. And so I think, to focus on the Rocky Mountain Institute and their blockchain efforts when we have hundreds of billions of dollars flowing to wind and solar and batteries, and to some extent nuclear and some carbon capture technologies as well, I think that that sort of misses the forest for a couple of trees, in my view. The Rocky Mountain Institute, of course, is famous for its staunch anti-nuclear positions, which is something that we would be far more concerned about debating and trying to overcome. To the extent that and a lot of this sort of blockchain stuff was announced during sort of the go-go days of the crypto boom, and I wonder how the ongoing Operation Choke Point 2.0 crackdown of the crypto space might make some of these projects a little less appealing to those that were excited about them when they were launched.
Yeah, I often see a lot of rhetoric, just anti crypto statements coming from a lot of different players in Washington, but at the same time I'm seeing those same people that work for the government or work for the think tanks kind of shift their whole career in the blockchain space. Of there's former Treasury Rosie Rios.
Sure.
There's big players in the crypto space, yet they're announcing something different. As a matter of fact, I think Biden just said that they're going to go after crypto tax cheats, right? So there's a lot of noise being made, and if you like kind of dig in the weeds, there's something real going on here that I think often gets overlooked. So
I would be cautious about putting too much weight on the fact that former government employees are accepting a lot of money to go into any industry, because that's just sort of a standard operating procedure, sort of the revolving door of going from government official to well-paid lobbyist is a well-worn path in the energy sector, in this case, crypto, blockchain, into law, into safety. You have sort of ex-government officials at high levels of Boeing or Tesla, or pick your favorite company that has an awful lot of interactions with the U.S. government. And so that former officials are ending up on the payroll of various crypto-related projects is just kind of the way it works in Washington, D.C. Doesn't necessarily mean that, and obviously in this case, it means nothing to the policy of the U.S. Treasury and the Eye of Sauron and Operation Choke Point 2.0, because Binance is filled with lots of ex-government employees, and so too, frankly, was FTX and many of the other schemes that have collapsed. And so the presence of former government employees in and of itself is not necessarily an indicator of government acceptance, broader government acceptance of a policy. In our view, that's how we view the situation.
Yeah, it's kind of like Janet Yellen getting paid $10 million to give a speech, right? They're easily accepted into the board if it's a free equity or check or whatever. With everything that's going on, I often hear gold bugs talk about the fragility of the system and how bad the system is. Yet we've gone from 0 to 5% interest rates, and really things are breaking. Definitely things are breaking, but they're still figuring out bandages to fix it. And when I listen to Fed officials, they pat themselves on the back as saying, from 2008, we set up this really strong collateral requirement. We have Dodd-Frank Act. We have all this stuff that's going to make the banking system more resilient. How do you feel about the fragility of the system?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and I'm harking back to the crisis of 08, 09, when we saw some early rumbles in the banking system, but then for a multi-month period there was some question as to whether Perhaps things had been contained or stabilized. And one wonders whether, with the recent sort of mini crisis in the regional banking sector, whether we aren't in that sort of post Bear Stearns, pre Lehman Brothers period, which was actually, in retrospect, a far longer period of time than perhaps many people remember it. We sort of cluster that whole series of events as one global crisis. But if you were living through it as I was in industry, it was in fact a very long time between those two events. And there was an extended period of time where people sort of felt like everything was okay. I don't know whether we're at that point where we've pulled the pin on the grenade and it hasn't yet gone off and we should all breathe a sigh of relief. For sure, we've pulled the pin on a few grenades. The speed with which that the Fed has aggressively raised interest rates is indeed probably unparalleled in history. And we are beginning to see some things break. Whether or not we sort of have the big debt jubilee, great reset on the horizon, the fourth turning as it may be, remains to be seen. I would be doubtful that we've seen the worst of things yet, if you pushed me to it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, something doesn't feel right yet. Equities like Nvidia has hit all-time highs, right? It's kind of like this mix between extreme speculation and extreme fear. And at the bottom, right, there was this moment where we thought every bank was going to collapse. Some of the stable coins started depegging, and like there's this immense fear, and we immediately just jumped out of it right into euphoria. And really, really odd to me, just like analyzing just the way people reacted to that whole entire time of setting up that window that the Fed created for the banks. Do you think that that window that they set up for the banks to borrow against collateral, do you think their balance sheet can explode just because the banks are underwater with a lot of under their bonds and mortgage-backed securities? I look at a chart of TLT and it's like 50% down. Even outside of the U.S., you look at like the gilt market, it's taken a massive hit, right? And bonds are supposed to be somewhat stable, and this underpins the whole entire economy. Yet, they're 50% down. Do you think all the banks would borrow at the Fed's window and try to make themselves whole? And would that make the Fed's balance sheet explode to a point where people notice?
So I don't think that's the immediate threat. And, bonds going down 50 cents on the dollar is you're almost certainly talking about long duration bonds where they're extremely sensitive to and interest rate risks. And, dropping a couple hundred basis points can really tank, the mark-to-market value of a bond. Most of the big losses on mark-to-market are sitting at, of course, the too big to fail banks. And last I checked, nobody's panic pulling deposits out of those institutions. Deposits are certainly down, but for a variety of rational reasons, and not the least of which you can get much higher yield at a Treasury direct account or a money market fund than you can get at one of these too big to fail banks. I think the bigger challenge is one that really, again, I like to give credit where I read stuff. I was reading Luke Roman's latest Forest for the Trees over the weekend, and he pointed out two pretty interesting facts which were counterintuitive and tells us that we have potentially, a significant challenge ahead. And his view is that higher interest rates is in fact bullish for inflation and is going to cause significant inflation. And there's sort of two main rationales that he put forth spread across his latest piece that came out on Friday. Three actually. One was the fact that in effect, we've never raised interest rates at this level of debt before, which means when we raise interest rates, the actual amount of interest payments coming out of the Fed acts as a de facto fiscal stimulus. Now, it's not sort of direct stimmies to people that are likely to spend them right away. It's more geared towards the wealthier part of society who would be in a position to own such debt. But still, at 5% interest, given the debt levels that we have, interest payments are becoming a larger and larger portion of our fiscal spending. And if you have 500 billion or 600 billion more in interest payments going out, that's largely indistinguishable from military expenditures or other fiscal. Might take a little longer for that mechanism to be felt. So that's one. The second is mortgages. So the vast majority of high quality homes are now trapped in mortgages that nobody will want to trade out of, which is then causing a boom in new construction as the stock of available homes for sale is insufficient to meet the demand for new home buyers. And so in reality, if you're sitting on a 2% mortgage and mortgage rates are 7%, you're just not selling that house. You're just gonna you're sitting on a basically a mini lottery, right? And then to move out of that home would be prohibitively expensive, and most people would be unwilling to do it. And then the third way that higher interest rates is actually going to spur elevated inflation is the increment of growth in the oil sector has been the Permian Basin and the shale patch for the past decade and a half. And at these elevated interest rates, the cost of capital far exceeds the desire to drill at this point, because ultimately the cost to drill the incremental well is going up by rates that are much higher than inflation. And so getting access to that capital is becoming too expensive. And so we're going to see, the world's really powerhouse of growth for the oil and gas sector for the past decade. If that begins to roll over and then we end up in an oil and gas shortage again, then that's sort of the third leg of the stool that counterintuitively, I think Groman argues quite persuasively that actually in the Fed's endeavor to increase to tackle interest rates through increased to tackle inflation through increased interest rates. Sorry, they're in fact potentially exacerbating it, and that's a really fascinating way to look at the world. Last point, again, is that in an elevated interest rate environment, that's typically not good for risk assets, which then drives down tax receipts, which causes sort of a debt spiral, a classic developing world debt spiral, where you have to borrow more just to pay the interest on your debt as your interest rates rise. And so it's truly an unprecedented situation. And then the big question becomes, is the Fed ever going to pivot? And in that case, yeah, there are serious, incredible projections that the Fed balance sheet could blow out to 40 or 50 trillion dollars in the right set of circumstances.
Yeah, I've actually heard congressional members interviewing Janet Yellen and bringing up that number, 40 trillion dollars, in the next couple of years, we should be projected to head there, and she didn't really have an answer for it. But, certainly with the debt ceiling and everything that's going on, do you think like at one point we do default on our debt, or do you think it's more likely that we just eradicate the debt ceiling completely and just nobody knows about it anymore, and we just spend whatever we want?
So we have effectively defaulted on our debt. Depends on how you define debt, of course. But under no credible scenarios, absent sort of a vast energy efficiency improvement, are we going to be able to pay back the debt and meet the obligations we've promised in the form of entitlements to our society? It's just the math just doesn't work out. And traditionally, there's only two ways to default. You don't make payment, or you debase the currency. And historically, debasing the currency, because it's a drip and not a whoosh, tends to be the politically expedient way. And if you look historically at all previous examples of hyperinflation, there was always a point early on where governments could have hard defaulted, and many have, by the way. So that's why hyperinflation is in fact pretty rare in society. But I suspect that the U.S. Won't be missing an interest payment or a principal payment on its debt anytime soon. But what that debt means when you collect on the principal 10 years from now, as it pertains to purchasing power, could be a wholly different thing. And so when given the choice, I suspect that the U.S. will go the soft default route. But it's just undeniable, I think, mathematically, that we are currently in a position where we will eventually have to default on these promises. And our T-bills and T-bonds are nothing more than a variant of many promises that the government makes that it can't fund. It just is. And so eventually, could be a very long time, that which can't go on forever usually doesn't.
Yeah, I was listening to Jeff Snyder. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he talks a lot about the euro dollar market and kind of the resiliency of the system with dollars. And it's like, what we're printing all this debt. We really don't know what's going to happen, but the whole world relies on the dollar. So it's kind of difficult or challenging to actually hyperinflate. What are your thoughts about the euro dollar market pegging the dollar as like non-hyperinflation asset?
Yeah, I would certainly defer to Jeff on all things euro dollar. It's certainly not within my domain of expertise. There's a utility and a demand for dollars that's why I said earlier, like I could imagine a bifurcation, but I don't see any abandonment of the dollar. But there's just this sort of fiscal inevitability, like the demand for dollars notwithstanding. Ultimately, um, it's hard to imagine a world where the Fed's balance sheet needs to grow to 40 or 50 trillion dollars and there isn't an inflationary pulse associated with that. I don't know. I suppose, I could be exactly wrong. And I'd be more than interested to learn why, because like to me, yes, of course, there's a vast international utility to the US dollar. And for decades, we have enjoyed some of the privileges that come with being the owner of the reserve currency. Now, that also comes with all the challenges we also talked about earlier, which is sort of a hollowing out of your manufacturing base. And so, at my sort of high level, if the last 40 years was a trend in one direction and that period is over, then a reasonable place to start to predict the future would be a negation of what we have seen in the past 40 years and assume that as your base case. And what have we seen in the last 40 years? We've seen deflation. We've seen, bond market rally. If we're truly at sort of a turning point where the U.S. is dedicated to onshoring and all the other things that we've talked about here, then you would assume that we'd be in a period of relatively high inflation. And then when I ponder the points that Lou Groman makes, because I see it, like I with our contacts in industry, it's becoming ever more difficult to drill for oil. And of course, the oil price that we see on the screens is probably different than the physical price that it's transacting in the economy. But I would say that because of my sort of admittedly lack of knowledge of the euro dollar market and the intricacy, certainly compared to what sort of Jeff Schneider understands, perhaps I've underestimated the counteracting forces that the utility of the dollar in those markets might play in this scenario. I'd be the first to admit that's possible.
Well, I mean, to me, it seems more like we're pushing people away from the dollar system completely by sanctioning Russia's central bank. I mean, that's never happened before, right? You've never seen a G7 central bank get sanctioned the way it has. So I think it really sent a shiver down the spines of everybody that's not exactly a U.S. ally, and we're seeing that with BRICS nations and with digital assets, with crypto assets, you're able to put anything of value on these protocols and send them instantaneously. You can instantaneously swap with other assets, atomic swaps. So it's very possible that countries can trade with dollars. However, the dollar is liquid, right? You can have high interest, you can earn a yield from dollars, right? So when you have trillions of dollars, like there's only the dollar market where you're going to get a yield from it, right? So they could definitely use it as a medium of exchange and kind of they're the counterparty of each IOU token. But I mean, the technology is there to bypass them. The issue is, where do you park the money after you've made it, right? It's not that easy.
I think the greater issue is, do you want to participate in the regulated US dollar economy at the end of that series of transactions? And this is where the US government is overtly trying to make that more and more difficult to do. And in fact, we wrote a piece warning that the same set of tactics being used by the US government could easily be applied to gold, physical gold. And we could see the exact same set of propaganda being applied to holders of gold. And in fact, in that piece, we talked about how the large refineries are essentially sort of physical manifestations of like crypto mixers like Tornado Cash, once sort of hot gold or money laundering gold or gold that enables drugs or sex trafficking, or pick your favorite vice that is typically used as part of the propaganda campaigns around these crackdowns. Once hot gold gets into sort of the regulated refineries, it becomes indistinguishable. It's not like at the atomic level, you can tell where this gold came from. And so it gets commingled and mixed and forever hidden. And that could be the centerpiece of a campaign of propaganda to crack down on owners of physical gold in the Western US dollar regulated market. Like I do think that people need to sort of open their minds to see what the consequences are of this recent crackdown. We've been pretty skeptical of most of the crypto world. We're always try to be careful to distinguish between Bitcoin and crypto. we do think that crypto is replete with an awful lot of fraud, and we were surprised, frankly, that the U.S. government waited so long to crack down in the manner in which it has done. But that doesn't mean that we're necessarily comfortable with the techniques and precedents being set as they go about, kneecapping Signature Bank and ejecting otherwise law-abiding businesses from the banking system and whispering to the banks that they shouldn't bank crypto and so on and so on. Like, these are all very dangerous precedents that are sort of extrajudicially applied to the sector. If the government wants to crack down on crypto, they should pass the laws and do so accordingly. Having said all of that, per your point, of course, Tether is in many parts of the sort of digital economy the functional equivalent of US dollar. But if your objective is to get back into the sort of US dollar regulated system and spend that money, there's going to be a step at some point in the chain where you will necessarily run afoul of the US laws, in my view.
And that's a really important point, because I do know, pawn shops, when you have something stolen, you very well know that the person brought it to the exact pawn shop, yet they'll tell you they didn't see anything or anything like that. The gold gets melted down, they get paid, and a lot of crime actually is involved with that, right? Like, a lot of people, a lot of thieves,
of course,
pawn shops and pawn the gold, and it's as good as cash, right? You're definitely going to get money at one point with gold, get gold jewelry or something. Then they refine it and kind of mix it like a crypto mixer. I mean, my channel is mostly dedicated to crypto assets that serve a purpose, right? That kind of bring efficiencies to the old system and able to do something in a more constructive, productive way that's more efficient, that costs a lot less money. And this ranges from data to rendering to cross-border payments. There's all these different applications that get used by it, and yet most of the media's focus is on the crypto scams, is on the Bitcoin maxis that are almost treating it like a religion, right? And it never really gets shown like what the use cases are, what different projects are trying to achieve, and like how they're going about it, and how it's helping with certain things. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, I would say though that one of the challenges with this space is sort of always the token and the blockchain, right? And so the token is the vehicle for speculation, and it makes it easy for those who don't know very much about the technology to just ascribe all this to sort of zero, ZERP policy, casino, post-COVID, board at home sort of gambling outbreak that we saw. But unfortunately, the allure of the token and the pump and dump schemes and the fraud that the undoubting massive amount of fraud that we saw, for example, at FTX and Celsius and other sort of overt Ponzi schemes, does allow the critics of the sector to paint with a very wide brush. And so there is, of course, a significant risk that innocent, authentically useful projects will get caught up in the flood of enforcement that is, I think, still ongoing. Like, I don't think we will see the end of this crypto winter until we've long argued Tether is not a thing, and Binance is sort of resolved, and maybe a few other dominoes to fall. In the aftermath of that, we've also said that projects that survive this would be pretty interesting to look at as potential investment opportunities. It's sort of like the dot-com crash, right? In 99 and 2000, the companies that had some substance and survived that epic downturn turned out to be the market champions for decades, right? And so, but I don't think that we're anywhere near the end of what's coming. And I think this is much more to do about power and the eye of Sauron at the US Treasury, which Ben Hunt has brilliantly articulated as a great model to observe what's going on. And so I would be cautious on this space, at least until those larger issues are resolved. And for your point about Bitcoin maxis, God knows we see an awful lot of trolls on Twitter, and even people pay to subscribe to Doomberg so they can comment in our pieces. I've never, as much as I'm a fan of gold, I would never let gold define my life. It's amazing to me that people allow an asset to define their very existence. It's a bizarre sensation.
Oh, I agree 100%. And it's weird, right? Like it certainly becomes a religion, and you know, the people's identity is wrapped up in it. I mean, you know, you mentioned FTX and Binance and Tether. Those, in my opinion, like you're absolutely right. I think this space is getting regulated, and it's kind of, we're seeing all the ugliness of regulations coming forth. You know, I'm seeing all over the world, different jurisdictions are introducing crypto regulations, MiCA in the EU. You know, they're all over the world. The G7, G20 are ironing out crypto regulations, and the US is last to the party, and they're trying to push everything under the SEC. And a lot of these scams, I think, are ongoing just as officials are collecting evidence against certain people. All this stuff is on chain, and you know, in the crypto community, people like admit crimes. People got called out for crimes, pump and dumps, frauds, scams, and it's literally evidence that I think regulators are just collecting and just waiting for their turn to just scoop up everybody that did wrong. And you know, they're just building cases at this point and letting them, give them enough rope to hang themselves, so to speak.
You know, it's funny. In the early days of Doomberg, before the energy crisis, we spent actually even more time writing about crypto. We were sort of crypto naive, and but we sort of had some high-level principles from the real world. And one of the earliest pieces we wrote, which almost nobody read because we were much smaller back then, was a piece that we wrote, geez, all the way back in July of 2021, called "About That Tout," where we were like, you know, amazed at the willingness of high-profile celebrities with large social media followings to tout, you know, shitcoins. And shitcoin rug pulls were very common back then, as you might recall, right? And you know, we started the piece mentioning this amazing book, you know, 3 Felonies a Day, how the feds target the innocent. Like the average U.S. citizen unknowingly commits 3 felonies a day, and really, when everything is a crime, nothing is a crime, first of all, but second of all, when everything is a crime, basically you're at a point where the prosecutor can decide who goes to jail for any reason whatsoever. And to be so obvious and so blatant about pumping and dumping these obvious, you know, token shitcoins really blew our mind, you know, because like we've always been very careful. This is not investment advice. If we have a position in something that we're writing about, we try to disclose it. You know, pumping something while failing to disclose that you have a financial interest in your audience buying that thing is in fact in many ways a crime. And we've seen, you know, Kim Kardashian and Paul Pierce and other celebrities get caught up in this and actually charged by the SEC. And we've seen Shaquille O'Neal dodging a subpoena from the FTX case for weeks at a time. You know, like it just blew our mind back then, even at the peak of the frenzy, that these people in positions of great responsibility, really, if you have 2, 3, 4 million followers on Instagram, 10 million followers on Instagram, the things you post really matter, and they're going to be high profile enough and get on the radar of these prosecutors who can choose from, you know, a whole plethora of laws with which to hammer you with. And boy, if I was advising these celebrities, I mean, unlawfully touting digital asset securities is not something that you want to mess around with, and many have. And as you said, all of this, you know, I'm reminded of a friend of mine who didn't like what one of his teenage children was doing on their phone, and he reminded that child that there's a fine line between instant and permanent. And as you say, this is all permanently out there, and everybody, you know, any prosecutor looking to make a name for him or herself decides they want to take down somebody like Steven Seagal or, you know, DJ Khaled, or pick your Floyd Mayweather Jr., or pick your favorite people that got caught up in all of these scams, really blows our mind. And so that's sort of, but not having to, you know, there's no need to have a deep understanding of cryptocurrencies, tokens, blockchain, all that stuff to understand that celebrities shouldn't be touting stuff that ultimately result in significant retail losses. And that's just one example of behavior that we see in the space that just feels wrong to us and ultimately has proven to be.
Yeah, like you said, it's amazing that they didn't know. Like, how do you not know that shilling a scam is illegal, right? Not just a token, but a scam that ends up rugging and then do it again, right? Like, it wasn't just an isolated incident. Many of these celebrities took on project after not even a project, just the meme coin pump and dump, and just kept getting paid, kept pumping them. But like, there has to be somebody that when you're that wealthy and that famous, you have to have agents and stuff kind of giving you a voice of reason. I don't understand how that even could occur, right? And then that goes back to our talk about, like, is this just idiotic behavior, or is there somebody pulling strings with all this stuff?
All I can tell you is, like, the bigger we get, the more paranoid I get, and maybe that's just the way that I'm wired. But like, we have much less to lose now, and so I want to make sure that I'm like, the old expression when you're doing your taxes, you don't want to be over the line, but you're okay if your shadow is. I don't even want my shadow anywhere near the line. I don't want to be on the IRS's radar. Who does? And neither do I want to be in the crosshairs of prosecutors. You talk about the IRS and that little trap question they've been asking people for years about whether you have basically anything to do with a digital asset, and yes, no, with no further follow-up. I bet you a lot of people have been checking no for several years that ultimately in hindsight will wish they checked yes.
Yeah, and I mean, it's very confusing since the laws aren't ironed out. You won't have a CPA that's willing to do my taxes. I have to do them all myself, and it's a challenge to go through everything. I actively trade every day. I'm actively earning yields in different products, doing different things. So there's a lot of transactions that I have to go through, and it's not an easy task. And there's nobody that's really skilled enough to do it for you, or there's nobody that's understands. There's no like basic laws. Like, you don't know if staking is income, or if this is income or not. So most of the time I just say everything's income, like you said, and just be over the line, and I'm actually paying more money than I should just for safety reasons. But I'm more cautious than
And
not.
most, yeah.
Yeah, that's challenging. So I've seen DeSantis and other politicians start this this talk about banning a CBDC. It's almost like a campaign. I've been researching CBDCs like since they came out. I never thought in a million years that this would be like a common topic where people would, talk about, normal people would be talking about it. And I certainly contributed to the surveillance state fear. However, if they don't have a CBDC and it's just stable coin providers providing the service, you're going to have stable coin providers that follow the laws to a T. They're not going to bend the laws. They're going to follow them to a T. So it kind of changed my mind about CBDCs, and especially, like, I'm working with a project called the XX Network. Dr. Chum is creating a CBDC for Switzerland that makes it almost like cash. It's completely anonymous. There's no way to track it. And what I'm getting at is, like, do you think it's better for Congress and the Senate to say, we're going to allow privacy to this extent and kind of redefine the KYC AML laws, or do you think it's better that stablecoin providers just provide it and then the government has to subpoena the stablecoin provider to get any information?
I would say there's a difference between what I think should happen and what I think will happen. So I don't want to, people to confuse the two. I would be staunchly, look, the ever encroaching surveillance state is real. Anybody who denies it is naive. And The Eye of Sauron that I mentioned earlier was a brilliant piece by Ben Hunt at Epsilon Theory. If those listening haven't read it, they could just Google Ben Hunt in praise of Bitcoin. It was a really brilliant piece, an eye-opening piece. The U.S. government wants to see every transaction in the world. And nowhere in the Constitution are they afforded this right to invade our privacy. But, it's just a matter of fact that citizens are becoming less and less able to keep private the manner in which they are operating in the economy, and to keep the details of their economic activities away from the U.S. government. And there's serious dangers in that, including targeting of your political opponents, but sort of more dystopian, as you mentioned earlier, beginning to sort of overlay a carbon agenda on top of what you're allowed to buy. And I see, Darren, that you've flown twice this month already. Maybe you should take the bus. Boy, that's an awful lot of beer you've bought. Are you hosting a party, or is that all for yourself? It very quickly dissolves. I'll give you a small example. I recently purchased a car. And so then I had to go to the DMV and get title. And, first I got proof of insurance, and then I went to the DMV and I got a title and I got plates. And the nice lady at the DMV looks at my license and says, "Oh, this is expiring in a few months. Would you like to renew it now?" I say, "Oh, yeah, well, okay, sure." So she punches up some stuff on the keyboard and takes my picture and then takes a piece of paper and staples it to my license. This is an interesting story, and you'll see where it's going at the end. And I said, she's like, "Here, if you get pulled over, just show them this piece of paper I've stapled to your license, and that will serve as your temporary license until the new one comes in the mail." Now, in my state, concurrent with this, there's been a serious crackdown in the documentation around those who sell beer and their efforts to make sure they're not selling it to minors. So it's not actually a crackdown on selling beer to minors, it's a crackdown on how well are you documenting your efforts. And most of the major retailers, grocery store retailers that also sell beer, have basically gone from allowing their tellers to punch a button that says, "I acknowledge you're over 30, to "I acknowledge you're over 40, to "I acknowledge you're over 50, to now they must scan in your driver's license if you're going to buy beer. Because they want to document that every sale of beer was tied to a government-approved driver's license. Now, guess what happened to me? Well, the person who stapled a piece of paper just happened to put it through a magnetic strip. And the only device they had at the store that I was shopping at was a swipe, where they would put the card through a little swipe and would read it. They couldn't just like scan it. And guess what? I couldn't buy the beer because there was a staple through my magnetic stripe. And even though I'm closer to 70 than I am to 21, and everyone in the store knows it, I suddenly was not allowed to buy beer. Now, that's not a law, but that is an interesting example of where we're going, right? There will be no privacy in any transactions, and you will be allocated. It's a very, very, very short line from government knowing everything you're doing to the government controlling everything you're doing in the name of some greater social good. And that's very, very dangerous. And I think my little story about accidental stapling leading to what is clear a grown-ass man not being able to buy a case of beer on a Saturday afternoon of Memorial Weekend is perhaps, maybe I'm reading too much in it, but it was certainly an interesting and fascinating circumstance for me to experience personally.
I had somebody reach out to me and tell me that they gave the truckers $50. They donated $50 to the trucker. They had $500,000 in their account. Their account got frozen for a $50 donation.
This is where we're going, right? I mean, and people had their Bitcoin seized, right? I mean, this is exactly my point. And if you can't see that, you can't see this direction that we're heading in. Like, the woman at the counter was nice enough, but she's like, "I don't care if you're 90. I'm not allowed to sell you this pack of Coors Light without a license that I could scan into this machine right here." It's not like she could make a copy of the temporary license that I have and keep it in her files in case the government comes down. No, no, this is a policy of the chain that I was shopping at, but that policy is a reaction to what the government is selling them. And so you very quickly get to the point where whether it's the government or government collaborating with big corporation, which is sort of the literal definition of fascism, it's a very, very short putt from here to there. And sure, well, if you have nothing to hide, what do you care is sort of a standard thing, but privacy is a fundamental right. It's not, it shouldn't come with a stigma of guilt by association with it.
I agree 100%. And this needs to be, written in law that we have some privacy because, like I said, stablecoin providers are going to follow the rules. And I hope that everything that's being brought to light, that it actually gets ironed out in DC where we're able to have privacy. It's technologically possible. We can have privacy. CBDC could be private. It could just be like cash on the internet, and that's it. However, there's certainly people that are trying to push it towards being more transparent, more vulnerable to these types of corruption. And that's a scary thought, if it ends up that way. I kind of fear for my daughter's generation, just with everything that's happening.
I would take the under on privacy suddenly becoming a key priority over control as technologies evolve.
Yeah, and there's also possibilities for all this to serve a purpose. What they're trying to achieve, right? Drug dealers, money launderers, terrorist financing, they can have everything private and kind of trigger under certain conditions if X, Y, and Z is met, we could reveal a transaction. It doesn't have to be, this dragnet surveillance transparency. It's nuanced, they can do things that are technologically possible to kind of prevent the things that they're worried about, but at the same time, have the ability to buy a beer or do something like that without it being corrupted. And it could even get down to like a voting level at one point.
I mean, we all still take off our shoes, at the airplane 22 years after 9/11. So I guess that was a few years after 9. That was the shoe bomber, but you get my point. Like the increased security and all of the surveillance state tools that were brought in weren't just limited to terrorists. I mean, they've been deployed across the entire society, and we've just allowed this incrementalism, this incremental degradation of our freedoms. And again, to protesting the lack of freedoms too hard will get you on a list. I mean, this is it's naive to think otherwise.
Yeah, actually, I didn't think about that. But yeah, I mean, you talk too much, right? You get the attention of somebody like we were talking about earlier. Regulator puts you on a list somewhere, and now you're susceptible. I mean, I listen to Peter Schiff often, right? And like his father was jailed for telling people it's your constitutional rights not to pay taxes. He died in jail just for arguing that point. And so, I mean, it's very possible.
Indeed.
So I've heard ideas, a reset. If we come into these types of situation where a reset is needed, and do you think it's possible that they kind of reset us to a CBDC type of system, or is that thinking?
I don't know. When I watch what's going on in Europe, and then I see sort of, on the one hand, we have a degrowth summit in Europe a couple of weeks ago, where literally they're talking about how people need to make do with less. And then over here, you have DeSantis, passing laws that ban, central bank digital currencies. That I suspect that the U.S. won't go quietly down the same path that Europe sure seems to be going on. But, that which can't go on forever usually doesn't. And we are going to need some kind of a reset. And we would view the path through that reset as sort of a singularity event. The laws of physics break down, and it's impossible to predict what's on the other side. It could be the rise of totalitarianism or a strongman, or pick your favorite. Who knows? Just a brace for impact would be our advice.
Well, I see we're running out of time, so I really appreciate you coming on. Like I said earlier, I'm a huge fan of yours. I've been following you pretty much since you came out. Just in the early days, I've been following you. So it's an honor.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's great. It's been fun. The hour flew right by.
Yeah, it did. Well, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. If you enjoy content like this, please consider joining my Patreon or my Ghost site. Doomberg can be found at doomberg.substack.com.